All right, welcome to Chapter 1 for Psychology of the Criminal Mind, Introduction to Criminal Behavior. To start with, let's review some terms that we're going to hear throughout the semester. First of all, what is crime? Crime is a behavior that is either, that is banned by law, right? It's prohibited, and has a punishment that goes along with that. Now, this can be behavior that the law says you cannot do. It could also be behavior the law requires you to do that you fail to do. So something like registering as a sex offender. Criminal behavior then would be behavior in violation of that code. So failing to register as a sex offender would be criminal behavior. Now, to be convicted of a crime, we generally have to show that at a minimum, your behavior was voluntary, okay, it's intentional, doesn't have any justification or excuse, and that it also has some kind of intent, with the exception of strict liability crimes. Those are crimes that do not require us to show criminal intent, and they include things like speeding. You don't have to prove someone intended to speed. Just by virtue of speeding, you are guilty of breaking that law. Now, scientific theory is a set of propositions, ideas, concepts that have been brought together to try to explain some phenomena, some behavior that happens, and to be able to predict that behavior as well. Now, a scientific theory of crime should give us a general explanation that encompasses and connects many different social, economic, psychological variables that apply to criminal behavior. It should be precise in its terminology, and the purpose is to identify causes or precursors of criminal behavior. Now, in order for theory to be of any use to us, it needs to be able to be falsified. We have to be able to show that it couldn't be true. And if we can't do that, then we kind of can't prove that it is true. Now, often what will happen is people will develop models. These are representations of a theory or a concept that are designed to enhance our understanding of it. Now, in terms of theories of crime, there's so many, okay? And we have Intro to Criminology, CJ 105, we have CJ 420, which is Advanced Crime Theory, and then almost every CJ course we take includes some explanations for criminal behavior, okay? So, just world hypothesis is this idea that we live in a just world, and people who do bad things will suffer the consequences, and people who are good will have rewards for that, okay? People who believe in a just world hypothesis tend to support capital punishment. They don't tend to favor social programs. And it can be really helpful for people on a personal level to help them get through difficult things, right? It can help us cope with bad life circumstances because in a just world, right, if I'm good, eventually good will come to me. Now, the classical school of thought is a pretty straightforward school of thought, and it basically says that our behavior is driven by free will, okay? And this comes from this man, Cesare Beccaria, and he says behavior is driven by choice, that people make a rough calculation of the pros and cons of their behavior and then choose accordingly, okay? Punishment then should be swift, certain, and severe enough so that people don't engage in that behavior. Now, deterrence theory is classical school of thought, and there's like a neoclassical school of thought. So like a newer version of this, because Beccaria is around like a couple hundred years ago. Okay. This is the idea that because punishment exists and you don't want to be punished, you won't break the law. Okay. Things like harsh sentences, capital punishment is justified based on deterrence theory, surveillance cameras. Now, positivist theory is an enormous school of thought, and it's basically every other theory of crime. It says that crime is not simply a free will choice. We don't just decide. That there are things that impact that decision. There are social antecedents, things like poverty, race, social class, all kinds of things that play a role in people's decisions to commit crime. And the idea here is how can we try to fix those things that lead to crime? Okay, now thinking about some perspectives here on crime, right? One is this idea of conformity. Okay, and a conformity perspective says humans are creatures of conformity and we want to do the right thing. Okay, And this includes a few theories, okay? Strain theory by Merton. Merton says that we are fundamentally conforming beings, and society tells us appropriate goals and appropriate means to achieve those goals, okay? And that crime results from a disjuncture between the two. So what happens when you want to live out the American dream? You want the white picket fence, you want a vacation home, you want 2 cars, you want all those things, okay? What if you can't achieve those the way you're supposed to, which is going to college, getting a good job, right? Saving. That crime comes when people try to adapt to that. Okay, and that's basically like a very abbreviated version of this theory. And if you're a CJ major or you've taken criminology or you've taken advanced crime theory, this theory should sound familiar to you. Now, Agnew expands on this and tweaks it a little bit and basically says that strain, which is basically like stress, right? Stress that we experience. And it can come from a couple places. One is an ability to achieve our goals. You've been working hard, you studied for some tests, and you just bombed it, okay? It could be the introduction of a negative stress in your life or the loss of something positive. And if the way we react to that strain is with anger, then that could lead to crime. Now, nonconformist perspectives look at things like biological theories. Now, early biological theories are wild. They're things like, if I feel your head and feel the bumps on your head, I could tell what type of offender you are, or I could tell your personality from that, okay? They also used to believe, a long time ago, that like, oh, redheads were more prone to crime. So if you had like 2 people accused of a crime and one had red hair and one didn't, the redhead was just gonna kind of SOL. Hershey looks at social control theory. He says that basically we're all bonded to society, and that when that bond gets weakened or is non-existent, that's when we're likely to break the law. And then Hershey also has another theory that he wrote with Gottfredson, and this is the general theory of crime. And it's basically that low self-control, right, leads to crime. There's also learning perspectives, okay? This talks about how do we learn behavior. Differential association says that criminal behavior is learned the same way as all other behavior is learned, okay? And it walks through that in detail. And social learning theory talks about some concepts that should be super familiar to psychology majors, like modeling behavior and reinforcements and punishments. Now, there's also developmental approaches, and these are a little bit newer in criminology. And it talks about how our behavior, how criminal behavior starts, escalates, declines, and then drops off, okay? And it's looking at our development over a lifetime, okay? Behavior begins in early childhood. They've done some studies where, you know, they ask like preschool teachers, kindergarten, first grade teachers, you know, about students in their class, and they're actually fairly good at predicting who's going to be a problem. Now, this looks at different periods of our lifetime, right? And a newer area, right, a newer term is this emerging adulthood, which is where you guys are, right? College students, young adults, early 20s, okay? And it's really looking at the role that emerging adulthood plays. Now, criminology is an interdisciplinary or a multidisciplinary field. It's made up of so many different other fields, as evidenced by the fact that this class probably consists of psychology majors, criminal justice majors, maybe some human service majors, maybe some people who are just like, yeah, criminal behavior sounds interesting, okay? And so sociological criminology looks at demographics and group variables. It's looking at society and the role society plays in that. And it looks at both structural causes, so the underlying foundations of society, things like employment and education, and then also the culture. It also looks at something called conflict theories, which look at how power is distributed in society. And that includes everything from how we define something as a crime to how the laws are enforced. So I'm recording this lecture in the summer of 2025. And right now we're going through a period where our federal administration is using ICE to snatch up all kinds of people, right? And you can see a lot of this unequal power distribution playing out in our current policies. Psychology is also closely tied to criminology, right? This is so while sociology is going to look at a societal level, psychology is going to look at like, an individual level, right? This is the science of behavior and mental processes. It's going to look at things like our cognition, our attitudes, beliefs, values, and thoughts. Any sort of links between neurological causes and biological causes. This could be things like traumatic brain injuries, aggression and violence, developmental theories, trait theories. A trait is a stable, consistent personality disposition that we have, right? Like, do you have friends that are like super chill and calm all the time? Do you have a friend who's a hothead? Those are personality traits. How these tie into criminology is many ways, right? But we often see a focus on psychopathy here. And that's callous, unemotional traits. It's a lack of empathy, a lack for the concern of the welfare of others, and persistent aggressive patterns of antisocial behavior. Closely related but a little bit different is psychiatry. Psychiatry is a medical doctor, right? So a psychiatrist is a medical doctor. They can prescribe. Psychologists cannot prescribe medication. Traditionally, this is like Freud and psychoanalysis, but there's so much more to it today. There's a lot of research and clinical experience looking at mental illness as more of a medical model. So those are just some very, very, very brief discussions of like theories. Okay. Now, how do we know how much crime there is? We've got different ways of measuring crime. And CJ friends, buckle in because you've heard this lecture a million times. New friends, sit back, relax, and learn a little bit about crime. So there's official statistics. These are generally from police data. And originally, this was the Uniform Crime Report. And it's still called the Uniform Crime Report System, which consists of several reporting systems. But today we use NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. Okay? We also have self-report studies and victimization studies. And you guys you're already familiar with this, whether you realize it or not, because you have seen data from all three of these sources in news articles and journals you've read. Probably on TikTok. So the UCR program has 4 main data collections, okay? It no longer does the UCR summary reporting system. It does have NIBRS, which has replaced the UCR. So for a while, both of those were in operation, and I think in 2020 or 2021, we transitioned fully over to NIBRS. They also collect hate crimes data. They also collect, there's one that's not on here, supplemental homicide reports, and law enforcement officers killed and assaulted. They also will publish special reports, cargo theft, human trafficking, etc. And they are managing a new national use of force data collection project. All of this data is freely available. It's on the internet. You can download it. It comes in massive chunks. They do write reports that are easier to digest, but if you already have or you are going to take SS 317, Statistics for Social Sciences, maybe you're in that currently, you will learn how to use that data. So in 1930, it's important to understand what the UCR is, even though we don't use it anymore, because NIBRS was built off of that idea or in response to that idea. So in 1930, Congress surveys the U.S. Attorney General, authorizes the Attorney General to survey crime in America, and the FBI is designated to implement it. Okay, and what they wanted to do was allow people to look at crime over time. Is it increasing or decreasing? And so they created this thing called the Crime Index. Okay, the Crime Index was 8 major offenses, 4 crimes against property, and 4 crimes against people. Okay, so your violent crimes are murder, forcible rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. And then your property crimes are burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, and arson. Now, a couple of things to know. If you want to study arson, don't use the UCR. You need to study fire data. Okay? Robbery is technically a violent crime and a property crime. Robbery is the taking of property from somebody else under threat of violence or by using violence. Okay? Sometimes people will say, I came home from work and I was robbed. No, you weren't. If nobody was there, you weren't robbed. Robbery involves a threat to somebody. If you came home and someone broke into your house and stuff was stolen, you've been burglarized. Burglary also does not actually require a theft. It's the breaking and entering of a dwelling with the intent to commit a felony inside. So one thing the UCR does, and NIBRS does this as well, is report crime rates. Okay, so it will give you the raw data. X many homicides occurred in Massachusetts in this year. Okay, but it'll also give it to you as a rate per 100,000 people. This allows us to compare crime rates over time as the population changes, and it allows us to compare places that have different populations. An increase in rate means the crime rate is increasing faster than the population. Now, rates also require some interpretation, okay? Because some of this has to do with what gets reported, what do the police do with this data, how do they classify it? Okay, that's like a master's level class. But for example, up until 2011, rape in the UCR is forcible rape of a female only, okay? So you can't compare pre-2011 and older data to current data, okay, for rape, because it's defined differently. Today it is defined properly, meaning it's gender neutral and it just requires a lack of consent. So what does the UCR include? The UCR includes arrest data from police. Police departments generally report to their state UCR program, and then the state reports to the FBI, and they report once a month. While there is a very high rate of compliance, it's technically voluntary, and sometimes a district will report in 1 month but not another. Some people aren't reporting. It tells us a few things. First of all, you want to remember this is only crime known to the police. It's data that comes from the police, so if the police don't know about it, it's not going to be in there. It also is going to tell us crimes cleared by arrest, okay? How many crimes resulted in an arrest? It can tell us how many people were arrested and characteristics of them. As I mentioned, the UCR was broken down into two parts, right? Violent crimes and property crimes. Then there's part two. Part two is 22 additional offenses, and they only report arrest data. So they only report data when an arrest occurs for these crimes. Now, the UCR used to publish a crime clock, and I'll show you what that looks like. Well, actually, it looks like this, okay? And what it basically would tell us is how often particular crimes occur, okay? So there's a violent crime every 25 seconds. This is in 2010. A property crime every 4 seconds, right? So a murder every 36 minutes. We don't publish this anymore because we don't publish the UCR anymore, okay? The UCR also used what's called a hierarchy rule. So generally when someone breaks the law, they're committing several offenses at once, and only the most serious one was recorded. So it means a lot of data is missing, okay? They do report exceptional clearances, as does NIBRS. So NIBRS does not publish a crime clock. NIBRS does not use the hierarchy rule. NIBRS will report up to 10 crimes that occur in a criminal incident, okay? Both report exceptional clearances. This is when we know someone, we know who committed the crime, but for some reason we cannot make an arrest. And that reason has to be outside of the control of the police. So the person died, they died by suicide, they fled, those kind of reasons. Both the UCR and NIBRS also divide the country into 4 regions. This is just based on geography, but they do publish a lot of data about, like, so for instance, the Northeast has the lowest homicide rate, and the South has the highest homicide rate. As I mentioned, they report clearance rates. Clearance rates are like solve rates, okay? And they're basically when someone has been arrested, okay? Solved doesn't mean the correct person was arrested, and it doesn't mean they're prosecuted, convicted, or incarcerated. Now, official statistics are super useful, even though they are gonna miss things not reported to the police. First of all, they do represent the overwhelming majority of the country. The flaws are consistent from year to year, so trends are probably still accurate. They are also moderately accurate measures of certain types of serious crime. So for instance, the murder rate is pretty accurate in official police data. Dead bodies usually show up. Okay? Not always, but usually. Things like domestic violence, sexual assault, petty theft are often not going to be in there. People are often not going to report them. Now, some disadvantages are, one is called what we call the dark figure of crime. Okay? Basically, that's crime that the police don't know about. Okay? Only about a third of victimizations are reported to the police. There's all kinds of crimes that don't technically have a victim, like dealing drugs. And the police don't actually detect crimes on their own. Usually someone calls them, right? Even if the police know about a crime, the offender is often not caught. And even if caught and identified, they might not be arrested because police have discretion, right? So if any of you guys were ever at a party when you were underage and the police showed up and you weren't arrested, right? Those crimes are not going to be in this data. People are human. They're entering data. They make mistakes, okay? They also sometimes distort their data, okay? So they'll do what's called unfounding a crime, okay? An unfounded crime is when I go to the police, I report a crime, and the police do not count it in the data because they do not consider it to have happened. Sometimes, to make their crime rates look good, departments will classify something to a lesser crime. And as I mentioned, the UCR followed that hierarchy rule. Now, the FBI recognizes some problems with this, and they developed NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, okay? And it's broader, it's more inclusive, it gets much more information. You can connect the information about the crime to the offender, to the victim. You can connect all that data. You can actually do a lot with this, and it collects data on a lot more crimes. I've used NIBRS several times, but I used it for my dissertation, where I looked at statutory rape and in some other statutory rape studies I've done. So NIBRS is developed in 1986, and it's done so in response to criticism from the UCR. Collects data on each single incident and arrest. There's 22 categories made up of 46 specific crimes. There are Group A crimes, and then there's another 11 Group B offenses. Group A is kind of like Part 1 of the UCR, and Group B is kind of like Part 2. And here's just a list of these. I'm not going to read them all to you because you can read them faster than I can read them out loud, but it just kind of gives you an idea, right? So Part 1 of the UCR is just 8 crimes. And here we already have more, okay? Also, NIBRS collects more data on each of these crimes, so it's much better data. And here's the rest of that. Now, for Group B offenses, they only report arrest data, and that includes these, okay? So, as I mentioned, I did my dissertation on statutory rape. I could not do it with the UCR because the data does not exist in the UCR. So, some things about this data that are better, okay? The UCR is a summary reporting system, so you can look at an aggregate information about crimes. This is incident-based. Each line of the data is like for an offense. It's going to include every offender, all their characteristics, every victim, all their characteristics. It has so much data in it, okay? It's kind of, each year comes in 5 parts, and you have to merge them together because they're so big, okay? Much more detailed information. But I mentioned that dark figure of crime, right? So how do we find out about the crime the police don't know about? One way is through self-report studies. We can do surveys, we can do studies, we can do interviews where we ask people about crime they've committed, okay? It's done mostly with incarcerated adults because it's an easy population to find, okay? They're interviews or questionnaires. And some of them are longitudinal, have followed a group of people over a period of time, which is fantastic, okay? It allows us to establish causal order, that the cause came before the effect. One is the ADHealth study, which is the adolescent, oh God, I don't even remember what it all stands for because I just always call it ADHealth, okay? It can be used for criminology. It's great for human services. It's great for psychology. Some other self-report studies, we do some national studies on drug use. One is Monitoring the Future. That's done with 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. It's been done for decades. It looks at a wide variety of behavior, but the thing it's most known for is like drug behavior. Okay? So lots of different options for that. And again, if you guys are taking, if you're currently in stats or you already took stats or you're taking stats in the future, we will work with some of this data. We have some Monitoring the Future data that we've used. We have some crime data. Now, some issues with self-report. First of all, are people being truthful? Okay. So people have done research on that. Are people truthful in self-report surveys? And it turns out they are generally truthful. It's moderately accurate. Okay. They might use different methods of testing this. So maybe in addition to doing a survey of some population, I also have access to like school records or interviews with their families. Maybe I use a lie detector test. Maybe if I'm surveying them about drugs, I'm also drug testing them. Okay? And that can let us know if people are being truthful. There's also ways to design surveys where you can kind of look for that. And that's something you can learn in research methods. So it's moderately accurate. People are reasonably honest. There's a little bit of underreporting for serious offenses. Now, here's a fun fact. Okay? When you survey boys, right, they tend to overreport being violent, right? They tend to like embellish their bad behavior. Girls tend to diminish it. Okay. So problems with this. People don't do these long term generally, okay? So like Monitoring the Future has been done long term. There are some that are long term longitudinal studies, but it's difficult because there's not a lot of nationwide studies to look at trends this way. It also tends to underestimate serious crime because a lot of times the surveys don't ask about serious crime. They ask a lot about, minor stuff that most of us have probably done. And they also don't tend to sample enough serious offenders to get that kind of data. A lot of these are done in schools. And so people who've been in a lot of legal trouble are often not in school. So they're not going to be included in these surveys. Now, there's been some attempts to make these better, right? So there's a lot of computer-assisted interviewing techniques. People are tweaking, like, how do you measure crime, right? So one thing you can do, there's a really interesting survey done by David Lisak out of UMass Boston it's about undetected rape. And they asked men and surveyed men about sexual assaults for which they had not been caught. Now, they're not like, hey, did you commit any rapes you didn't get caught for? Because who's going to answer that question? Nobody. Okay? Instead, they ask what's called behaviorally specific questions. They describe behavior and ask if you've ever engaged in that. And a surprising number of men had. And none of them, not a single one of them in the survey, had ever been caught. They often try to eliminate trivial acts too, things that like are developmentally normal. Like sometimes we do want to study truancy and drinking underage, right? But if like that's what I'm using to measure delinquency, well, then probably everyone's delinquent. They also make some efforts to sample in communities that have high rate offenders and more serious offenders so you can get them included in your study. Now, the flip side of this is a victimization survey. We can also ask people about their experiences being victims of crime. If you were here in the spring, which you probably were if you're in this upper level class, but if you were here in the spring of 2025, we did a survey college-wide. Not a lot of people did it, but we did a survey college-wide about victimization for sexual assault, stalking, things like that, okay? That's a victimization survey. The most well-known one is the National Crime Victimization Survey. That's done by the government. It's been done for, I don't know, since this, I was going to say 30 years because it's from like the 70s, but that's 50 years, which I should know because I'm from the 70s, but in my head, I think I'm still 30. You can ask all kinds of questions here, okay? Now, the NCVS is done, a household stays in the sample for 3 years. They get interviewed 7 times because they get interviewed at the beginning and then every 6 months, okay? Now, they ask about everyone who's 12 and older in that household. Note, they do not study homicide because you can't interview victims of homicide unless you want to get out a Ouija board, and no one's probably going to publish that study for you. But we can ask questions like, did you report this? We can ask questions like, why didn't you report this? This also will ask some, questions that will help us estimate things like domestic violence, sexual assault. From this, we can see patterns in intimate partner violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, differences in terms of demographics, who's at higher risk. There is also an international crime victimization survey. And I did a study on that like 100 years ago. If anybody wants to see it, I can show you some of that. Actually, I think we did it specifically about sexual assault at an international level. Now, the NCVS is done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics and the Census Bureau, and it began in 1972. Oh, guys, it's literally exactly as old as I am, so I should not have thought 30 years. Okay? And there's a little video here that can help you learn a little bit more about this. So as I mentioned, people 12 and older, covers rape, robbery, assault, larceny, burglary, personal theft, motor vehicle theft. Okay, doesn't cover arson either because that's difficult to measure. And as I mentioned, if you want to study arson, you should get fire data for that. Doesn't cover Part 2 offenses because those are considered victimless crimes. Sex work, drugs, things like that. It has data about the characteristics of the crime, the time it occurred, the location, number of offenders, whether weapons were used. For victims, age, gender, race, ethnicity, marital status, household composition, education. Perceived characteristics of the offender. If you know who your offender is, you might know these things, but a lot of times, like if it was a stranger, what do you think their age was? What do you think their gender was? Were there financial losses or injuries? And as I mentioned, it also covers like reporting and patterns of reporting. So this covers fewer crimes. It also reports rates, but it reports rates per 1,000, not per 100,000. So you have to do a little math if you're going to compare official statistics to victimization. And there will be more in the victimization, but if you look at the trends, they're very similar. Okay? Some limitations with this. First of all, a lot of times people will telescope events. So if I asked you, have you been a victim of a crime in the last 6 months? Okay. Currently, it's going to be September when you're listening to this lecture, unless it's not 2025, and then it's going to be, might not be September. Okay. If I ask you about a crime that happened to you 6 months ago, that's going to put us back in March. Okay. Maybe it happened at the beginning of March. Maybe it happened at the end of March. Maybe it really happened in February. Okay. It also records, follows a hierarchy rule, and only records the most serious offense. Over time, our memories are not a DVR player. Every time we retrieve a memory, we change it. Okay? People have faulty memories. Data entry stuff. Doesn't give us any information about victimless crimes. It's also important to note that a lot of times these kind of data sets will not include unusual events. Okay? So the 2001 UCR does not, I don't know why I have this on the NCVS page. It doesn't belong here. But the 2001 UCR does not include the homicides that occurred on 9/11. It includes other homicides, but it does not include the murders, the terrorist murders. Why? Because it's an unusual event, and if you put them in there, it's going to screw up your statistics royally. Okay, now we can also look at juvenile crime. We have a whole course on juvenile delinquency. Here's 2 seconds on it, okay? Juvenile crime has decreased since the 90s. By the way, crime in general has decreased since the 90s, okay? Juveniles, however, though, can also be charged with what's called a status offense. These are things that are only illegal because of their status, and their status is that they're juveniles. They're minors. Things you can do as an adult that you cannot do as a juvenile, okay? Run away. You can run away. You can't pretend you were kidnapped, but if you run away, that's fine. We don't have curfews. We can drink if we're 21. We can skip school, okay? Incorrigibility is being a stubborn child. There are a few really great data sets on juvenile justice. There's 2 Philadelphia birth cohort studies. One was done by my mentor, and then the other one was done by his mentor, Marvin Wolfgang, who's like a super well-known criminologist. Those studied an entire cohort. It's all the people born in a particular year in Philadelphia, and it follows them into adulthood. But a lot of times we don't have things that are you could use that ad health data to look at juveniles over a period of time. But most juveniles do what's called age out. Okay, we do dumb things when we're kids, and we often grow out of it. All right, that covers chapter 1.